met them.
Okay. Everybody should be muted except for Ken and me. Shalom, everyone. I'm Nina Levitt, Temple Emanu-El's chair of Israel Committee. I am absolutely delighted that our very own Ken Marsh has kindly agreed to present on making Aliyah. This program is about Ken's experiences since he made Aliyah in January, and that Tanis will make Aliyah late in June. They have been very active Temple Emanu-El members for over 10 years. They've attended services and events and have taken the lead in various capacities, including Ken as the first temple administrator and current past president. Tanis, as we all know, was instrumental in creating the very popular and special Starfish program. If you have questions, please send them through chat, and we will, and Ken will address them. I'm going to turn over now to Ken.
Good evening. Thank you, Nina. Good evening, everybody. I want to thank the Israel Committee and Temple Emanu-El for allowing me this opportunity to share with so many friends. Are you all seeing my picture? Yes, okay, all right. Well, we're going to go ahead. So let me screen share here and oops. And oh, sorry about that. And which one? Right. Here we go. All right. So so here's the presentation that I'm going to be going. We're going to go till as late as 8:15. Nina is going to wrap this up at some point. So I'm going to share what Aliyah is. This is in addition to what some of you may have learned when Toby Halpern did an Aliyah presentation at the Israel Committee earlier this fiscal year. I'm going to talk about the Aliyah process, the formal and informal assistance that I received, my journey and the landing, a bit about the bureaucracy of Aliyah, and then my life in Israel. And as Nina said, please submit your questions via the chat. Please do not send it specifically to me because I won't be able to monitor the chat for personal messages. So send them to everyone. And Tanis is right here by my side, and she's going to be keeping track of your questions and making sure that I get to them all. So that's the way that you have for some input. So what is Aliyah? Many of you are aware of this. It relates to the law of return passed unanimously by the Knesset back in 1950. I don't know how much has passed unanimously by the Knesset since then, but this certainly did. And essentially, in quote there, you see every Jew has the right to come to this country as an ole. An interesting aspect of this relates to what Israel's first prime minister, David Ben-Gurion, said, is that the law did not bestow a right, but rather reaffirmed a right that Jews already had. I'm not going to read you much during this presentation, but I do want to read this because it's important. What he said at the time was that this law does not provide for the state to bestow the right to settle upon the Jew living abroad, but it affirms that this right is inherent in him from the very fact of being a Jew. The state does not grant the right of return to the Jews of the diaspora. This right preceded the state. This right built the state. Its source is to be found in the historic and never broken connection between the Jewish people and the homeland. So this first section is going to be on the process, the application, interview, pilot trip acceptance, the Aliyah visa, and the actual flight. So I can't say enough good about the organization that many of you have heard of called Nefesh B'Nefesh, which means soul to soul. You see some pictures there. These screenshots, the next few of them come directly from the Nefesh B'Nefesh website. They're the primary organization that helps those wanting to make Aliyah, particularly from North America and Europe, South America as well. It was founded in the year 2002, and you see their mission there, really to make the Aliyah process easier, and then once an Ole or Olah is into the country, to facilitate that integration of them into Israeli society, and really to remove every obstacle to having someone who really wants to go to Israel and be a citizen to actually get there. And I cannot imagine having made Aliyah without their assistance. There was an advisor who was assigned to me, who was available virtually constantly for many, many months. So on this screenshot, you see their latest statistics since their inception almost 20 years ago, more than 65,000 Olim. Those have produced 15,000 new children born within the state of Israel, 7,000 lone soldiers. Many of you know those are, many of the lone soldiers include foreigners. Many of us know Bruce Kleinberg, who's been a member of our congregation here, who was a lone soldier before returning to the United States. Many of them do stay. And then you see a reference to 9,000 pioneers to Israel's periphery. The state of Israel encourages Olim to settle either in the north or in the south, in the Negev, and not just to concentrate in the center of the country. There are some additional stipends that go to people who are willing to move into those rapidly growing areas. You see the partnerships here with a number of organizations, both in Israel and outside Israel. A lot of donations that come in. Our application was $100, thanks to the assistance that come from these organizations. You see their names here, and here you see many of their logos that many of us do recognize. So in terms of the application process, you register with Nefesh B'Nefesh, and if you haven't done so, whether you intend to really think about making Aliyah or not, it would be very eye-opening were you to go to their website. Obviously, just Google Nefesh B'Nefesh, and you see all of the services that they do provide. There are two slides here that list all the documentation that's required through Nefesh B'Nefesh that goes then to the other organizations, particularly the Ministry of Aliyah and Absorption, for them to make decisions on who can actually enter under the law of return. Lots of documentation there. You can read those for yourself. And a couple of things, though, I do want to mention. One is proof of Judaism. You all know that both Tanis and I are converts, and therefore we had nothing in our personal or family histories that we could provide. That proof came from the documentation provided by our supervising rabbi, Michael Eisenstadt, who then was the rabbi at Temple Beth Israel on Longboat Key. He wrote a wonderful letter that also documented all the steps that we went through to make our conversion back in 1999. And then there was another letter that Rabbi Glickman wrote regarding what you see there, the personal statement of our dedication to Judaism. It's not just simply going through the conversion process, but since the conversion to really prove that one has committed to the faith by actions as well as intent. So all that documentation gets uploaded to their website, and eventually there is a review by the Jewish agency and by the consulate.
Ken, I'm going to interrupt to just say we were able to certify you as a super Jew.
Thank you, Rabbi. That might have actually would put us over the threshold. That was wonderful. You may be wondering, as we did, why they need some of this documentation, and we've come to learn that a lot of it relates to extenuating of circumstances. They're trying to make sure that people are not trying to run to Israel to run away from responsibilities here, especially whether it's related to children, if they're abandoning their family. They want to make sure that those who do make Aliyah are healthy and are not going to be a burden to the healthcare system that I'll be speaking more about later. So anyway, that's a lot of the documentation. It's also to make sure that the processing is done under the correct classification. Tanis and I have been accepted as Ole Chadash, which means that we are coming from abroad, never having either, we weren't born in Israel and then left. We haven't spent many years there under other kinds of visas. So because there are other avenues that people who have those experiences can qualify under. So we are, and probably 70 or 80% are Ole Chadash. It was relatively easy for us to find most of our documentation. We'll get to that a little bit more. Compared to the difficulties that we've read about online with others, if you imagine the millions who have come from the former Soviet Union, many of whom have no formal records, and perhaps they've not been practicing Judaism for a couple of generations, the difficulty that they've had in proving that they are actually Jewish. Certainly families from Europe who were affected by the Holocaust, their records may be lost. And then they're just the everyday kinds of loss of records, whether it's family documents in a fire or a flood or other things. We read horror stories of people for whom it takes a long time to find their documents. We had some bureaucratic hurdles, but nothing related to what so many of others had, in addition to the problems that COVID related to getting documentation. And then we get to something that we had not heard of. Those of you who are familiar with Aliyah or who are attorneys, especially if you deal with a lot of documentation, particularly international documentation, you know about apostilles. Many years ago, most of the countries got together to sign on to what's called the Hague Convention. It related to essentially providing an international notarization to help verify, validate, in our case, for instance, that our marriage certificate is really real, and therefore the state of Israel can also recognize it without us having to either get married again under Israeli law or whatever. And that holds true for birth certificates, marriage certificates, divorces, you name it. If there's a documentation that's required, in many cases it has to be processed as an apostille. So for instance, if there was a documentation for here in Florida, let's say I had been born here in Sarasota County, most likely my original birth certificate wouldn't be good enough. I'd have to get a current one updated by the clerk of the court for that county. And once I had it, then I have to send it to Tallahassee to the Department of State for them to process the apostille. All of that under normal circumstances takes a while, but under COVID, with so many offices not being staffed at all, they're staffed by people who are working at home. What should have been a 2 or 3 month process was taking at least 2 or 3 times longer than that. Back to one other slide from Nefesh B'Nefesh. You see there are 9 links right here to very important issues related to making Aliyah. And every one of them, there's a treasure trove of webinars and information that they can provide that answers so many questions as one is deliberating whether this is a move that one wants to make. Looking at some of the informal support services that are out there, right behind Nefesh B'Nefesh were numerous Facebook groups, and which is, I guess, however long we've had Facebook groups, this is an added bonus for people who are looking at making Aliyah now. I've highlighted on these next 2 slides about a dozen or so Facebook groups that we began monitoring long before actually putting in our application or finalizing the application. And there are thousands of people who monitor these Facebook groups and get all the information that they need right there. Toward the bottom, you see one called Olim Advisors. This is actually a Facebook group related to a particular business, where it's a concierge service, and they can, for a fee, they will process a lot of the bureaucratic forms, particularly once one gets to Israel. And then there's actually a Facebook group. I paraphrased it as Leaving Israel. It's actually something along the lines of get me the heck out of here. It's actually for people who have made Aliyah for whom that was not a good decision, and about how it is that they actually go back to where they were from. But all of those groups were wonderful and so very helpful. Some other informal resources. Natalie is the daughter of Janet and Stephen Hiller. She lives in Habanim, which is a moshav about an hour south of Haifa. And she made Aliyah, I think maybe 10 years ago or so. I actually had Seder this past spring with her husband Daniel, the family and in-laws. It was wonderful. Her Hebrew is pretty good, and she helped me a couple of times getting access to a couple of sites that I couldn't get Google Translate to work. Roz Rucker is the daughter of Nancy Rucker. Many of us know from the arts community and other things here in the Sarasota area. Roz lives in Kfar Saba and works with a travel agency there, and Roz has also been very, very helpful. The next item you may not be familiar with, called Relaxing Walker. I didn't find it until I actually was in Israel. It's fascinating. For those of you who really just want to see some video of present day Israel, just Google Relaxing Walker. There's a fellow he mounted a camera with a microphone onto his shoulders, and he's filmed in probably 20 or 30 sites within Israel, and he just walks for an hour up and down the streets. One of the most interesting ones was, you may have heard of the snowfall back in February, I think it was, in Jerusalem. He seized the opportunity, put his camera on, and went from his home or hotel to the wall during when it was snowing. You don't get to see that very often. And he covers a couple of dozen different communities within Israel. 2 books were very important for us, Making Aliyah, but particularly Smarter Israeli Banking, because banking is so very different there. More about that a little bit later. And then some of the media that we began monitoring, just to get a sense of current events and news. All 4 of those are in English, and ILTV has a daily English language news broadcast that you can subscribe to, and it's very, very helpful. a short list here of some of the possible issues and impediments along the way. I've deleted their essentially employment and children education. Thankfully, moving to Israel with children adds an extra degree of difficulty. Not unlike moving, I guess, probably anywhere. You want to make sure you move to the right community with the right kinds of schools. And if it's employment, then what your skills are and where people are hiring. Neither of those were issues in my case, but we had impediments nonetheless. We wanted to do what's called a pilot trip back in October, but with COVID, Israel was not allowing anybody into the country. With a pilot trip, again, whether you're moving to Israel or Chicago or wherever, it probably is helpful to make a little trip there before and decide what neighborhood you want to live in, and perhaps have an appointment with the bank and find your apartment, those sorts of things. We weren't able to do any of that, and so when I made Aliyah in January, I was essentially doing the pilot trip activities and making Aliyah at the same time. We also had some questions about affordability. I think everybody who's aware of Israel knows that there are some higher costs of living in certain aspects. And so the question that Tanis and I had was, can we afford to live there? Not that Sarasota, or particularly Longboat Key, where we've been living, we've been in this area over 40 years. It's not inexpensive here. Obviously, the closer to the water one is, the more expensive it is. So that was an issue. I can just say that for us anyway, at least in Netanya, it's affordable. I don't know if it would have been affordable where we're living in Jerusalem or Tel Aviv, but Netanya is affordable. Of course, then where to live was an issue. And then we made what was called split Aliyah, again, because of the lack of a pilot trip. If we'd been able to do a pilot trip back in October, we'd have been able to do our Aliyah together in the winter or in the spring. And being separated as we were, then Tanis and I, for 4 months was not pleasant. Thankfully, thanks to WhatsApp in particular, video chats, internet, all of that. It was so much easier. I would say we probably talked at least 2 times a day, sometimes 3 or 4 for long periods of time. But it was tough. And then, of course, as many of you know, we have 2 cats. And while I was certainly missing them, another issue had to do with getting the cats approved to go as well. Okay, so thankfully Nefesh B'Nefesh has not only flight coordination people, but people on staff there who can help with resolving issues related to bringing one's pets. They understand that pets are a part of the family, and so that has been an impediment. And all I can say is that we believe we've done everything that we need to do to be able to get the cats on the plane with us next month, and we will see how it goes then. So the next set of issues for us had to do with detaching from this area and reattaching in Israel. Again, not unique to going to Israel. Again, no matter where if you're making a long distance move, you're detaching from people and places and things. And so we were officially accepted. We got our Mazal Tov email from the Jewish Agency November the 9th. We'll never forget that day. And by Thanksgiving, we had put our plans in action and began sharing the news with family and friends. That was tough, but it's been very, very positive. Detaching from one's bank has been tough as well. In our situation, we needed to find a local bank that had international connections to where we could do wire transfers from in dollars to an Israeli bank in shekels, either without additional fees or the least possible fees. We were able to do that, but it wasn't easy. The other detaching was healthcare. For those of you who are covered by Medicare, you know that by early December of every year, you have the option to re-up for what your plan is, whether it's Part A, Part D, whatever. And that was a bit complicated deciding what to do. I still get Medicare Part A, and I still pay for Medicare Part D. Although I haven't really used either one in 2021, but I did discontinue my Florida Blue supplemental plan. Cell phone and internet is also difficult in some ways to detach, but many of you are aware that it worked really well, at least for the cell phone. I was not aware that this was even technologically possible, but my phone number that I've had for many years here in Sarasota still rings for me in Israel, and I have an Israeli phone number. It also rings on my same device. And so that's made it easy, although the downside of that is that at 2 a.m. I get spam calls and reminders from the local pharmacy here that I need to renew my prescription. So there's some downside to the phone care, to the cell as well. A couple of things back to the healthcare. I'll maybe talk a little bit more about that later, but so far what I've been paying for healthcare in Israel is about 10% of what I was paying for healthcare here in the United States. And so far with no difference in the level of care or access. Talk about what to bring. Again, most of you are aware that Tanis and I have been living aboard a boat for 25 years. We have very little in the way of furniture, but so we're not doing what's called a lift, like on a container ship. We don't have that much to bring anyway. When I went in January, I essentially had 2 suitcases. If you can imagine what you would do moving someplace with just 2 suitcases. So that was a bit of the reattaching as well. There were 2 impediments just before I was able to leave on Monday, January 25th. One was the very new requirement that I needed a PCR COVID test showing negative within 72 hours of the flight. And though that kind of arrangement was very new at the time, I was finally able to get it just in the nick of time. The other thing that was happening was that because of COVID and even though Israel had done really well early on with COVID, all of a sudden it was just out of control. And they closed Ben Gurion Airport. Actually, I'll put it this way, my flight took off 4 hours early so that it would be in the air when the airport in Israel was closed, and therefore we had to be allowed to land. So what happens at the airport for an Ole? Nefesh B'Nefesh typically has someone there, and many of you have seen the wonderful pictures of either charter flights that Nefesh B'Nefesh arranges, or for regular airline flights with a large number of Olim on them, where instead of pulling up to the jetway, people disembark down the old-fashioned ramp onto the tarmac, and there's, if not a band, there's music and flags and pictures and celebrations. I was the only Ole on my flight. There was nothing like that kind of greeting for me. but there were 2 or 3 representatives who did guide me through the process of being admitted into Israel during those special times. I had an Aliyah visa. I was first taken to a checkpoint where there were some soldiers who actually knew of my impending arrival. They gave me some paperwork and processed me to the next step within the airport. Saklita is a basket of benefits, some of which actually are given at the airport. So for instance, I was given an envelope with 3,000 shekels, which is about $1,000 to help with my adjustment there. Although, as you see in a moment, I was not going to have a chance to spend it anytime soon. Chupat Kolim is the essentially the 4 types of HMO kind of medical organizations that Israel has. Everyone must be a member of one chupat or another. And I'd already made my selection. I had my paperwork when I got to the airport. So as soon as I got to the airport, I was immediately a citizen of the state of Israel, and I was fully covered for medical care with no concern over pre-existing conditions. I walked another 100 yards, underwent a COVID test, then got my baggage, was put in a taxi, and went.
Military school.
Yeah. There was a fellow from the military who escorted me to the taxi to make sure that I guess did not escape going to quarantine. And I was taken by taxi to the Dan Panorama Hotel in downtown Tel Aviv for my 10 days of quarantine. Hebrew word for quarantine is bidud. So I was in quarantine for 10 days. The picture there that you see is not Tel Aviv, that's Netanya. We'll get to that in a minute. I could probably talk for the next half hour about bidud, but I'm just going to leave it as saying that it was just fine. The meals were fine, but I was confined to one room with a very small outside balcony for 10 days, and it was okay. I had one COVID test on day 7, another COVID test. And so the one I took at the airport and the one at 7 days were both negative. So I was going to be able to leave in 10 days instead of either 12 or 14. I was then put into a taxi at the expense of Jewish Agency or Nefesh B'Nefesh, which then took me to Netanya, which is about 20 miles north of Tel Aviv. I stayed in 2 different Airbnbs for the 3 weeks that it took me to find an apartment, during which time COVID restrictions were still in place. Restaurants were not open. There were hardly any takeaway options, but grocery stores were open, and I could walk for short periods of time as long as I didn't go too far away. AACI and ESRA are 2 English-speaking organizations that help with the adjustment of Olim to Israel. They're essentially like community centers. They do webinars and events, and it's just like having an English-speaking community center available for you. And they have offices in Netanya, plus in most of the other major cities around the entire country. Some of the bureaucracy there that was faced with, the very first thing that I had to do once I got out of quarantine was to get my Israeli ID. It's a Teudat Zeut, is the name of it. Again, everyone has one. It's the same size as a driver's license. It has my picture, my address, my date of birth, the fact that I am Emanu-El when I made Aliyah, and has my all-important 9-digit Israeli ID number, which is used everywhere. So in contrast to a social security number, which is kind of supposed to be confidential, everybody knows everybody else's number or could probably find it. It's the issue of privacy versus expediency, but it's used everywhere. It's on your checks. one of the really good things about the Israeli ID, for instance, is that medical records are available seamlessly no matter where I go. If I went to an emergency room, an ambulance driver, a doctor, all they need is my 2.Zut number, and they have immediate access to all my records. I don't need to spend 20 minutes at every new doctor's office filling out all the same forms again. On the other hand, there's no privacy. I continue to get a little bit of a stipend for the government for making the adjustment there. However, during this time that I'm in the United States, I'm not eligible to be receiving it. And there's documentation that warns Olim to make sure that the appropriate ministry, Misrad HaKlita, is aware that I'm not in the country, so I don't actually get a benefit that I'm not eligible for. When I inquired to make sure that they would know that I was leaving the country, or if there was a form to fill out, they just told me that they would know that I was leaving the country. Again, my 2.Zut, when I go through passport control, they know when I'm leaving the country whenever I enter the country. The 2.Ole, that is a separate documentation that registers me as someone who's made Aliyah. There's one per family. There's a number, so when Tanis arrives next month, we'll both have the same 2.Ole number. Bank account is difficult. Every American who makes Aliyah does have to complete a W-9. There are treaties and other arrangements between the United States and Israel regarding dual taxation and all those sorts of things. So bank account information is open. Kupat Kolim, I already mentioned that. I'm a member of Maccabi, again, one of the 4 HMOs for the country. And passport, I just received my first Israeli passport. It's good for a year, and I was able to use it the other day when I got on the plane to come back here for these 4 weeks. So in terms of continuing assistance, not only did Nefesh B'Nefesh have an advisor for me once the application started, but they're on call for an entire year after being there to help with questions that I might have, and I've called on them some. The benefits continue. Again, there's a number of benefits that Olim qualify for upon making Aliyah. Arnona, I'm going to mention it again later. Arnona is not only the name of a community or neighborhood within Jerusalem, but it is essentially the property tax bill. And there is a reduction in the amount of the property tax that Olim pay for the first year. There's also rental assistance. Again, Kupat Kolim is the healthcare. It is free for Olim for the first year. And actually for someone, even a senior citizen like myself, it's only 104 shekels, which is about $35 per month after that, believe it or not. And then there's Ulpan, which is, I now have up to 500 hours during the first 2 years for instruction in Hebrew language, speaking, and reading as well. I've registered for that. I've not been able to start yet. Because of COVID, they had such a backlog of people they'd not gotten to that I was sort of at the end of the list. And then AACI and ESRA, of course, continue to provide lots of resources, including English language library, counselors. They do lectures and tours and all of that. So there was an apartment search. Tanis and I are not going to be buying a place, at least for the foreseeable future, so it amounted to rental. Most rentals in Israel that we'd be looking for are in apartment buildings, whether they're some of the older 5- and 6-story apartment buildings or taller buildings. The picture you see on the right there is taken from the living room of the apartment that we now have through June of 2022. It's a bit complicated actually getting an apartment there. There's a broker fee. So instead of having, for instance, an apartment building have a rental office, every unit is owned by someone, and brokers will then be aware of where openings, where apartments are available, and essentially you pay a broker 1 month's rent once the contract is signed for helping find that particular apartment. Some landlords require a guarantor, particularly for those people like Tanis and I who have no credit history in Israel. They do not care what our credit score was in the United States, which is disappointing, but it's understandable. Just because we were able to pay our bills in the United States doesn't mean that we will pay them in Israel. All rent checks have to be provided in advance. So my landlord right now has a check dated the 1st of every month from now through till June of 2022, and he will deposit that check when it's time. So he already has those. Vad Bait essentially is the condo fee or association fee that covers the grounds and security and those kinds of things. Arnona, I already mentioned, is the property tax. And one of the differences is that in Israel, the renter pays the property tax, not the owner of the building. So as long as there is someone in the apartment, the renter pays the property tax and not the landlord. And then there are the utilities, which also take getting used to, primarily the electricity, water, and gas. They're typically billed every other month. Sometimes people will go 3 or 4 months without getting a bill. Apparently it's nothing to worry about. Eventually they catch up, and so far utilities have been fine and very, very inexpensive. Interesting thing about the water bill is that when you register for your account, you let them know how many people are actually in your unit, and then there is a quota that you have for how many gallons of water you are able to use. And if you go over that, then your rate increases significantly. Obviously, Israel is for the most year a rather dry, arid place. Most of the water for Israel, the potable water, comes from desalination, and there's a great reuse of water. I think 80 or 90% of all the water in Israel is reused for agricultural purposes. So again, lots of differences there with getting a rental. The picture on the right is a sundown from the balcony there for our apartment. And on the right is the picture of our 14-story apartment building. The streamers that you see there were put up for Israel Independence Day a couple of months ago. And with the cursor, I'm going to try to identify our unit. This is the entrance to the lobby, which is ground floor. First floor is above the ground floor. We are on the second floor, and we're in this unit right here. So this is the kitchen window, living room window, and balcony. So Judaism in Israel. Well, the picture you see on the right is for the one and only Reform congregation within Netanya, a very small, very old building. Rabbi Edgar Nof is the rabbi, and unfortunately, they've not been able to have very many services on site for the past year and a half. They have begun doing that. Interestingly, this particular building had an arms cache in the basement back during the mandate period with the British. Oh, right, and I'm reminded a member there of that congregation has a brother here at Temple Emanu-El. So there was a small world doing Jewish geography right there in Netanya. Beit Daniel, many of you are aware of. It's in Tel Aviv. Rabbi Meir Azari is a senior rabbi there, and he's been instrumental in the past 20 or 30 years in getting progressive Judaism to be recognized as legitimate within the state of Israel. I've attended services at both of those congregations in the past couple of months. Otherwise, stratified throughout Israel, of course, there's the Hasidim, the ultra-Orthodox, Orthodox, modern Orthodox, Reform and Conservative, in lesser numbers, and secular, who probably make up most of the population of the state of Israel, are those who really, they may practice some of the social customs of the religion and socialization aspect of it, but not actually going to services and otherwise participating. So some of the impediments that I experienced, certainly COVID, as I alluded earlier, doubled the application time. I'm not fluent in Hebrew and not been able to be in Ulpan yet. All I would say was that, and some of you as tourists have learned this as well, it's very important that you know your numbers up through 1 through 20 at least, simple greetings, and how to ask certain questions, where, when, and what will help a lot. However, Netanya in particular, and with younger Israelis especially, there's a great understanding of English, and many of them want to use their English rather than have me try to share my Hebrew with them. Scheduling appointments, there are 4-digit numbers, star 3241, for instance, might be to connect you to your Kupat Cholim. And then you have to go through the process of waiting for someone to say, if you want to speak in English, then you press that number, and then you're off and on hold for 20 or 30 minutes, waiting for someone to help. The social and cultural aspects of things, queuing is very interesting. Many of you who have been to Israel know the lack of concern for personal space. One is always being bumped into or bumping into other people. And if an organization hasn't arranged for a line where you get a number where you are in the queue, then it's more of a pile. And that's certainly the case getting onto a bus. There are no lines for getting onto a bus. You will just elbow yourself on. Bargaining, I guess, was something I thought was going to be more of an impediment, but unless one is buying a car or a house or something of significant value, you pay whatever is asked for, not even in the shuk. When you go for your fruits and vegetables and things, you're just not haggling over what you're going to pay for a kilo of strawberries. And then certainly the separation, 4 months is way far to be apart from Tanis. But many positives. The assistance, again, through Nefesh B'Nefesh, the English-speaking groups, has been unbelievable. Netanya is going to be absolutely the perfect place for us, less expensive than Tel Aviv and Jerusalem, but still close by, large enough for the medical facilities and events, amenities, and in Netanya, plenty of Anglos. I know of a number of people who have been in Netanya 5 or 10 years from Great Britain or the United States or Canada, who they probably know less Hebrew than I do, and they get along just fine, although I certainly want to learn as much as I can. Public transportation is wonderful, buses and trains. Took the train to Jerusalem about a month ago, thankfully, before the conflict, past couple of weeks. And I'll just share with you that the cost of the train ride from Netanya to Jerusalem and back, plus light rail and bus along the way within Jerusalem, cost $5. Again, for a retired person, $10 if you're not, but it's an all-day pass and extremely affordable. I can be in Jerusalem by train in an hour and a half, and in Tel Aviv by train in 20 minutes. Healthcare is wonderful, inexpensive, excellent. So many wonderful people. Met lots of people. It's interesting when I share with people that I am Ole Chadash, meaning I've just made Aliyah, that people are especially warm, although I expect that some vendors are especially warm because they believe that I'm going to be naive and they can get me to agree to do something. But nevertheless, the people have been wonderful. I really do enjoy the ease with which I'm able to actually celebrate Shabbat and other festivals and Jewish holidays. I've learned to get all my shopping done by Friday noon because the stores are not going to be open. Transportation's not going to be running again until at least Saturday night, if not Sunday morning. Israeli Sunday morning is like Monday in the United States and elsewhere around the world. And I've really enjoyed Shabbat. And the food is wonderful, very tasty and delicious. And now I'm going to at least end the formal part of the presentation with a quote from one of my new favorite authors. And I will be reading this to you. Jews have lived in almost every country under the sun. In 4,000 years, only in Israel have they been a self-governing people. Only in Israel are they able, if they choose, to construct an agriculture, a medical system, an economic infrastructure in the spirit of Torah and its concern for freedom, justice, and the sanctity of life. Only in Israel can Jews today speak the Hebrew of the Bible as the language of everyday speech. Only there can they live Jewish time within a calendar structured according to the rhythms of the Jewish year. Only in Israel can Jews live Judaism in anything other than an edited edition. In Israel and only there, Jews can walk where the prophets walked, climb the mountains Abraham climbed, lift their eyes to the hills that David saw, and continue the story their ancestors began, by Rabbi Jonathan Sachs, of blessed memory, in his book, Future Tense, A Vision for Jews and Judaism in the Global Culture. This is where I was going to end the presentation, but I'm going to include one more spill just because of some of the current, one more slide regarding some of the current events. Since I got to Israel, we're all aware of the terrible oil spill that spoiled almost all of Israel's beaches back in early March, including Netanya was affected. All the beaches are relatively clean now. There was a tragedy just a couple of weeks ago over Lag Bomer, Mount Meron. And then the current conflict with Hamas in Gaza. Thankfully, I was relatively safe in Netanya. There was the second night of the conflict. Around 9 o'clock, sirens went off twice. Quite a shock, obviously. I did hear some thuds and booms in the distance, which perhaps were Iron Dome activities, taking down rockets to the south, down toward Tel Aviv or Petah Tikva. But anyway, throughout the 10 or 11 days of the conflict, Netanya essentially was not directly affected. There was a strong message from the government and all the local municipalities to conduct business as close to usual as possible. There for a while, schools were closed for the entire country, eventually were opened in the north. Netanya schools remained closed until the ceasefire. there were daily changes in reaction to the rockets and the civil unrest. Some believe that civil unrest is going to be more of an issue long term than with the issue of Hamas. But one of the gratifying things for me anyway was the extent of the volunteering. People who, like myself, who were not affected directly by the conflict, were trying to volunteer wherever. I was not picked for one particular day. They just had too many volunteers. Another aspect, though, was I was very impressed by was that with the frequent reminders to the population of how to get assistance, counseling assistance, particularly for those people who were directly affected by scores, if not hundreds, of sirens and rushes to shelters over a period of 10 days, and the impact not just on children, but to everybody, and a heavy emphasis on providing counseling assistance wherever needed, as well as to those who are in the IDF. So at this point, I'm going to take a look at the kinds of questions that have come from you all. So let me look at these. So one of the questions, how does a Jew who is born a Jew prove that he or she is Jewish? And I'm not sure exactly how, because I didn't go that route, but I believe there are ways that it can be done with family records that trace their lineage back to others, and other documentation that has to be provided. Again, I can't provide a clear response to that because I didn't have to go that route. Yeah. Let's see. So the question, what's percentage of people who go and then decide later to return to their home country? I don't know. But I think it's a significant minority, and I'm hesitant to guess, but I'll just say maybe 5% decide it's not working for them. It's and I don't know historically. COVID has made it much more difficult because of employment issues. Another question, does Israel really need 2 more cats? Very funny, Howard, great question. When I've shared with my new friends in Israel that I'm bringing 2 cats with me, I get the standard response. If I want 2 cats, just go down to a corner with a bowl of food, and I can get 2 cats in an instant. If you haven't been there, you don't quite understand. There are cats everywhere. Let's see. So good question, was your approval complicated by you being Reform Jews? And it probably was a bit more complicated. 2 things were very helpful in that regard. One was that Rabbi Eisenstadt that I mentioned earlier from Temple Beth Israel was, again, who was our conversion rabbi, conducted the entire year-long process for us by the book, with a year of study and the counseling, Bet Din, mikvah, you name it. He documented everything, and that, I'm sure, was very helpful. As well as the letters from Rabbi Glickman regarding our commitment to Judaism for the past 10 years. Again, I don't know what to compare it with to know whether there are other converts, particularly Reform converts, who have had difficulty. It never became an issue during the process or with our with our discussions with our Nefesh B'Nefesh counselor. But along those same lines, the very first question that I had for the Nefesh B'Nefesh people was the extent to which Tanis and I, as older, retired, Reformed converts, would actually be allowed to enter as Olim. And the answer was absolutely. And in the end, it did turn out to be that way. Again, as I alluded to, there are many others who probably have been, their Jewish roots go back for generations, who are having greater difficulty proving their Judaism than we did. Another question had to do with whether I still use an American passport. So yes, again, based upon the arrangements between Israel and the United States, we have dual citizenship. I still have an American passport, and Tanis will, go through the same. So when I left Israel last Saturday night, I left under my Israeli passport, and when I entered the United States on Sunday morning, I entered on my American passport. Thankfully, I was in the shorter line with the global reentry. So yes, dual citizenship, and when I leave, I'll leave with the American passport and enter Israel when I get to Ben Gurion again next month with Israeli passport, and go that route. So, so address the difficulty that Ethiopian Jews have during airlift. Yeah, and as we all know, there are Jews particularly from Africa, Russia, other places where even if they've been practicing as a Jewish community for many, many years, for some reason, being able to prove that they were really Jewish has become very difficult. You all are, many of you are aware of the airlifts that Israel has sponsored over the past 20 or 30 years, particularly of Africans, African Jews coming in. And some of that continues today with a couple of aspects of, I think, Ethiopian tribes who are having great difficulty. Again, I'm not up to really to speed on what some of the impediments are there. But anyway, I certainly hope that they are allowed to enter. A couple more questions. Questions related to social activities for newcomers, tennis, golf, biking, bridge, meetup groups. Again, I mentioned the AACI, which is actually Americans and Canadians in Israel, and ESRA is English speakers something. They organize, again, musical events, lectures, tours. They do have a number of interest groups related to things like bridge, mahjong, not so much tennis or golf, but eventually you can find those who have those interests, although as you may know, as far as golf is concerned, there's only one course in Caesarea in the entire country. I did not bring my clubs. I'm sure they have some to rent there should I find somebody else who wants to golf. Some of you are aware, I've replaced the golfing here with hiking there. I hike at least twice a week, and Israel is just a beautiful country within which to hike. So many parks, so many trails. It's just wonderful, and the weather is wonderful.
Okay, last two questions.
Couple more.
No, last two.
Yeah, so just two more questions. Do I go by my Hebrew name in Israel? And that's interesting question. I could, if I had wanted to, well, for one thing, the name on my Teudat Zut and my passport is the Hebrew translation of my English name and not my Hebrew name. I could have, when I got to Israel, gone through a process in order to be able to have my Hebrew name become my official name. I did not do that. But it's sort of a bit of a funny story related to my name. Again, Ken. Many of you know Hebrew, and in Hebrew, Ken means yes. So when I'm in Israel, I hear my name called out all over the place, and I wondered whether I should perhaps go by a nickname so that would make it easier on me and everybody else, and decided in the end to keep the name that I'm known by friends as Ken, and so that's fine. Although I will have to say that when I order coffee at a place, I give them my middle name, Alan or Alan, so that when they call it out, not everybody is looking. Otherwise, I am Ken. And I guess the final question is what motivated the decision in the first place, and how did we make the decision? Don't really have enough time to get into all of that, but let me just say that every trip that I've made, that we've made, it was falling in love with Israel was more and more evident every time, and began to ask myself the question, as I sometimes do, no matter what new place I go to, what would it be like to live here? And could I live here? And then eventually, should I live here? And new friends in Israel, when they find out I'm from Sarasota and they know a little bit about the area, wonder how I ever could have left. And that's a very good question. But the answer is that it's not Israel. And after 40 years here, ready for a change, and Israel just has that kind of appeal. And the quote that I ended with a few moments ago says a lot of it. In order to really practice Judaism the way I want to practice Judaism, it can happen in Israel in a way that it can't happen in the United States. And so far, after 4 months, it's been the right thing to do. We'll see how it is long term. Hopefully, Tanis will love it there as much as I do. And she's been a frequent visitor, but a different frame of reference. But we will be we'll be there by this time next month. And for those of you coming on the temple tour in March of 22, Tanis and I are going to coordinate that with Rabbi Glickman and try to meet up with everybody. We know that the itinerary does not include coming north, but we could come down to Tel Aviv or Jerusalem and catch up with people. And for others of you who are making a trip to Israel now that the skies are opening again, let us know if you want to come by, and we've got a second bedroom, and would love to see you all there. So with all of that, back to you, Nina, for some closing comments or anything else. So again, thank you all for being a part of this and sharing your questions. Again, I'll be here for another 2 or 3 weeks. And if you do give me a call, please don't leave a text, because my phone service doesn't allow for texts. So Nina, thank you all, and the temple and the Israel Committee.
And Toda Rabah. Your presentation was both informative and enlightening. Kol hakavod to you and Tanis. All the respect, hatzlacha, good luck. Bashana haba'a b'Yerushalayim. Toda rabah. Lehitraot.
Okay, lehitraot.